I showed this thing briefly in the first supercharger video and mentioned that it came as a package deal with that purchase. Off camera, I tore the thing apart trying to figure out exactly what model it is. After doing a fair amount of part number research, I really can't tell what this is. The main problem that makes this difficult is since the choke tower has been milled off for performance reasons, for airflow reasons, the part number which would be on the air horn right here is gone. So I can't use that. On a Holley, each individual section does have its own part numbers, but I couldn't really find a good reference for that stuff. Either way, I think this carburetor will still be okay for this application. Something nice though is that I took this apart being ready to rebuild it, and look how clean it is. Somebody actually drained this thing and took care of it, and all the gaskets came off peacefully so I can go ahead and reuse them. The only change I'm making is these nylon fuel bowl screw gaskets, because that way you can take the bowls off repeatedly without having to worry about the paper gaskets. So the other modification, in addition to the milling off of this choke tower and blockage of the choke passage, is the addition of this pipe. What is this for? This is to boost reference the power valve. To boost reference a Holley carburetor, you drill through this wall right here in between these ports. See how the pipe runs all the way through it? You seal that pipe in there, and then you connect this to a vacuum port below the supercharger. So what is that doing? On the primary metering block, and sometimes on the secondaries if you have dual power valves, this one does not. On the primary metering block you have the power valve, which sits right in that cavity. So what is this doing? On a normal engine you have a pretty straightforward vacuum curve. It increases a bit off idle and then decreases fairly sharply as the throttle blades are opened. Normally this is open to manifold vacuum using this port here, this valve here, and this is a 65. This valve here will open when the vacuum drops below 6.5 inches of mercury. So why does this have to be connected below the supercharger? For the most part, the vacuum curve below the supercharger is pretty similar to a naturally aspirated engine. And the main difference being instead of stopping at 0 inches of mercury, it keeps going into positive boost. So when this is referenced below the supercharger, the valve functions in the same way and still opens when it reaches 6.5 inches of vacuum. Without the addition of this pipe and without this port being blocked, what will happen is that it's seeing vacuum at the base of the carburetor. Because the supercharger is forcing air into the intake and more air is flowing through the carburetor, under boost conditions, there's still going to be vacuum at the base of the carburetor. So the power valve, which enriches the fuel mixture, might never open. So the engine might not be getting the fuel that it needs to prevent it from going lean. Edelbrocks don't really need to be boost referenced because of how the piston setup works. You can just install a strong piston spring and that'll compensate for most levels of boost. But by the time the secondaries are open, if you have large enough secondary jets, the engine should be getting all the fuel that it needs. So back to this Holley carburetor. Since this thing was run on, I believe, a 383 with that 144 supercharger on it, I'm actually going to leave the power valve and the jetting alone for now. This power valve is probably a little on the rich side for the supercharger, but not too worried about being too rich at the moment. The jets are 76 on the primary block and 82 on the secondary block, which is fairly rich. It's difficult to tell because I don't know what it would have come with from the factory because I don't know what model it is. And it's hard to make too good of an educated guess because it's a bit of a funny setup. So the main two Holley carburetors that are similar to this one are the 4150 and the 4160. A 4150 will have dual metering blocks, but it will also have mechanical secondaries, and this has vacuum secondaries. A 4150 will have vacuum secondaries, but it will only have one metering block, and instead of a secondary metering block, it has a metering plate. But since we're keeping the jets and the power valve the same, I'm also going to leave the float setting where it is for right now. They look pretty even. On a Holley carburetor, you set the floats with everything installed and fuel in the bowls. So to reiterate, we're just going to hope the calibration on this thing is set up right and throw it on as is. It's kind of unfortunate it doesn't have a choke because that might make it a little annoying to start sometimes, but it seems like this engine starts really easily, so hopefully that's the same on this carburetor and we won't have too many issues with that. So I will be cleaning this up as I put it together, but it's already in really good shape, so I'm not doing anything too crazy. I'm just going to be spraying down every part with carb cleaner. And I'm also just going through and spraying every port I find with carb cleaner to make sure nothing is clogged up. As usual, I'm going to spray just a bit of WD-40 on both sides of these gaskets. And with all the surfaces clean, drop this on, make sure it's facing the right way, and kind of roughly line things up. I should have 6 of these big Phillips screws. So there's 6 of these. In fact, just for kicks, I'm actually going to put thread sealer in this bowl. Since this goes through to that power valve passage, you really wouldn't want any air coming through these threads, so Sure, why not? And then we can install the accelerator pump nozzle. This is a 35, and you gotta make sure you have the little weight that goes beneath it. The tip of it goes downward, and then make sure you have your gaskets. Bolt that right on. And we can make sure that's all working properly by spraying right here. Yep, we got spray through the nozzle, so the weight should be lifting up properly and everything should be set there. Next, let's go ahead and put the vacuum actuator on. The vacuum actuator is a vacuum diaphragm that opens the secondaries when they're needed. So when the vacuum on this port gets high enough, it pulls this in, which opens up the secondaries. Make sure you've got a gasket for that port, and it's these 3 screws. So with those screws tight, you want to make sure you've got this part of the vacuum diaphragm over this post here. And then you very carefully install the world's smallest circlip here. And make sure it actually clicks all the way on. The vacuum secondaries are in order. You should be able to open them manually and hear air coming out of that port. Next up, reinstall the accelerator pump onto the fuel bowl. This gets installed with the spring and the taller part of the cup facing the pump on the outside. You can see how it works. Use these 4 little screws. And of course, make sure the lever is hanging over the outside of the bowl, not the inside. You can make sure it moves freely normally, and then if you block that port with a finger, it should be very stiff. So this accelerator pump seems to be working just fine. You also want to make sure your needle is moving freely. So if you hold it in the upright position, you should be able to see the base of the needle sitting on the float and moving with it. You can also test this by just blowing into it, and you should be able to blow through it while it's in this position and not while it's upside down. Quick and easy test to make sure everything is working properly. So on the metering block, make sure the jets are tight, power valve moves freely and springs back easily, and all the ports are clear. This is a good time to take the metering screws all the way out and clean those passages, and then reset them to maybe 1.5 turns or 2 turns out for initial startup. So we can take the metering block gasket, make sure it and the surfaces it mates to are clean, line it up on the metering block, and then we have the outer bowl gasket. So then we can install the nylon gaskets onto the bowl screws, making sure everything is clean. Then we can drop the bowl gasket on, make sure that's the right way around so that the accelerator pump has its little passage there. Then we can sandwich it together. So once you have everything locked up, you want to make sure the lever for the accelerator pump is below the actuator thing that rides on the cam. There we go. And then you can tighten the fuel bowl screws up. And on the other side, it's the same deal. Make sure your float is at a good starting point level, and then clean up your parts, gaskets, and then bolt the bowl on. And there we are. Since this doesn't have a choke, that is the entire carburetor. It's really pretty simple. All the throttle blades move freely and return on their own. You can see the accelerator pump moving in concert with the cam. The cam is this plastic piece here. This one is a green cam. That sets the profile of the accelerator pump. But for the moment, we're all done here.